So yeah, I'm Tim Ward, CEO and co-founder of RedFlags. You may have come across us before called Think Cyber, but we've decided to kind of rebrand, focus on the amazing capabilities we have in our RedFlags tool, which we'll learn a bit more about in a second. So measuring what matters. Why do we measure security awareness? Why are we trying to measure the human factor in security? Why do we care about that? Well, obviously, you've got to tick this compliance box. You need to show, for many of the standards out there, that you're actually training people, that they understand how to protect themselves against threats. But there's got to be more to it than that. You want to understand why it's working in your organization. Is what you're doing the right thing? How many people you're reaching? But that's still not quite enough. Obviously, you've got some personal needs here, like you are trying to do a job, especially if you're a security awareness practitioner. You need to get your budget, you need to show that you're doing a good job, you've got to get that pay rise. But if you really want to be reducing risk in your organization, you need to be measuring something more than this. Yes, you want to know, are people actually engaging with the messaging you're delivering? But what really important is, are you actually changing their behaviors? Because if you're not changing their behaviors, you're not actually reducing operational risk, and you're spending a lot of money on security awareness that arguably is a little bit pointless other than ticking that compliance box. So what have we actually been measuring as an industry prior to now? We've been really focused on completion rates. And this is, to be fair here, this is because you measure what's easy to measure. But the problem here is just because people have done their training, that really doesn't necessarily mean that they understood it, that they're going to change their behavior. They may have passed the test, they may have used Google to pass the test, someone in the department may have passed the test and pasted it internally so that they could copy the answers. You really don't know what this is telling you. And this brings us on to a model of understanding how you measure things. This actually comes from a NATO model of measuring things in ambiguous situations. And they talk about two ways you measure an outcome. One is this measure of performance, and that's really what we've been doing with measuring completion rates, like, has the thing happened? But what we really want to measure is effect. We want to know that doing that training has actually done something, it's actually changed people's behavior. And the reason we don't really measure that very well is it's a bit harder. So what else have we been measuring? Well, we've been measuring click rates. It's very common for people to do phishing simulations, and you're measuring a click rate. I think there's a lot of reasons why this doesn't work particularly well. Firstly, you can kind of get whichever click rate you want, depending on how easy you set the bait. And so it's really not a particularly comparable stat, not a very useful number. I've spoken to people before who kind of run their regular phishing tests, and then there's a special test they do to show the insurers how well their click rate is. That happens to be quite easy to spot. It can give you a bit of a false sense of security because you may be sort of fiddling with things in your network, changing things so that when you run the test actually gets through. And so you're going, look, people are spotting this, but is that really a realistic test of a real phishing simulation, of what would really happen in the real world? It might be giving you kind of false behavioral insights as well. You may be having to tell your security team, oh, don't tell anyone this is coming, but actually they would spot phishing and they might block it. And so is it really a test of your defenses? There is a real danger here, and the NCSC have flagged this, that it builds a bit of mistrust within your organization. You are essentially trying to trick and catch people out, and there's evidence that suggests that if you teach people at the point of failure, essentially their ego goes, la, 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 this isn't happening to me. And so it's not a very effective way of training people. But if you are going to do phishing tests, and there are better ways, measure reporting rate. This is a much, much better measure. It's an engaged measure because people have to actively, deliberately choose to report. So this is a deliberate action. It's not something where you've caught them out. And it's really important within our training that we focus on both helping people understand the risk, yes, and that's where all the fear stuff comes from, but you also need to give them a coping mechanism. And a coping mechanism around phishing is report it. That's a really easy thing that people can go, right, I'm not sure about this, I'm going to ask. Reporting is also a good measure of detection and response. It's that early kind of warning system that you want. And one really important thing is you don't actually necessarily need to be running phishing tests to be measuring this. And so if you're looking at reporting rate on real emails and real phishing, then you're getting a really good measure of what's actually hitting your organization, and you can start to adapt to that and adapt your training to that. But what if you could have some metrics a bit like this? Yes, on the left-hand side, we've got metrics around phishing, click rates coming down, reporting going up. But here's some really interesting behavioral metrics that you could be looking at. So how many people are actually clicking a link in an email from an unknown sender in your organization? because that's a measure, a macro measure, of the risk in your organization, because one of those emails could potentially be phishing. So could we change that number? What about credential sharing? If they click a link, do they enter a password afterwards? What about, are they locking their screen? So general cyber hygiene, are they uploading files? So this is just kind of some broader measures of things that might be actually really quite interesting to help you understand what's really happening in your organization. So if we want to get stats like that, we need to think about behavioral science. We need to understand, how do people really learn? How do they actually behave? And how can we change that behavior? So firstly, we've got to understand behavior. And the problem we've got with traditional training is it relies on this rather simplistic concept, which works for your normal e-learning when you choose to learn something, but not when you're being forced to learn something in a cybersecurity sense. So the traditional approach says, look, give people the skills, the knowledge, the understanding. That impacts their intention to act. They think, yeah, if I do this thing, I'm going to get the outcome I want, and then they just always behave in that particular way. Well, if you think about how the world really, really works, it doesn't always work like that. Context interferes. The fact that you're sort of on autopilot quite a lot of the time when you're making decisions interferes, but also habit interferes. There's a really interesting research by someone called Carlson, who looked at how well do people follow policies, cybersecurity policies in an organization. And they surveyed people and they asked them about it, and they all said, yeah, I follow the policies. But then they started measuring who was. And if the organization actually had a strong sort of delivery focus, where essentially the message the organization set, the context was, we just want you to get on, we want you to make sales, we want you to deliver projects, then actually the policies went out the window. And so context can really, really powerfully affect it. So let's dig into that context a bit more and think about how our brains really work at the moment of risk. So many of you have come across this concept of bounded rationality, this idea that, yes, we all like to think we're really, really rational human beings, but when you look at the data, sometimes we do things that suggest we're actually not always acting that rationally. And the reason is that our brain is trying to cope with a huge amount of information that's being thrown at it at any point in time, and so it takes shortcuts. It uses simple rules of thumb. And you see this in marketing and advertising, of course. So when you're buying something, are you buying it because you really like the product, or are you buying it because you really like the person who advertised that product? And if you like the person who advertised it, you think they're attractive, it's a celebrity, then you kind of think, no, I like the product. And your brain makes the lazy decision and decides you like the product instead. And this must be true because there's a lot of money spent on celebrities advertising stuff. And you see it all the time in this kind of way our brains actually work and take these shortcuts. And so one example is priming. Derren Brown uses it in his shows. He'll be kind of talking about something all the way through, and at the end of the show, someone says the word butterfly, but actually that person has been made to see a butterfly repeatedly and had that word said to them over and over and over again, and they've been primed. So just even posters on your walls can start to prime people to think about things. Authority, you see this in CEO fraud, but you also see it in advertising. You see celebrities, you see men in white coats advertising toothpaste. Social proof, we're all social animals, so we like to do what other people are doing. We like to follow the social norms. Security, so scarcity and loss aversion, again, you see this on the internet. There's only one of these things left, or when you're trying to book an Airbnb, someone else is looking at it, quick, I've got to buy it. And so this scarcity really makes you sort of drive and change your behavior. We all think bad things won't happen to us, and we behave in that way, and that's a good thing. We probably should think that, but that means that we behave with that optimism as well. Loads of different mental models here, things that impact the way that we actually behave. And of course, you'll recognize a lot of these from what the bad guys are using against us, especially in phishing. So CEO fraud, that phishing attack where you get, here's the bonus spreadsheet, and you just can't resist opening that, even though there's no way you would have accidentally been sent the bonus spreadsheet for the whole organization. So what drives behavior at a sort of more macro level? Well, there's some really interesting models that tell us about how we actually make those decisions driven by these biases. And BJ Fogg says that for any behavior to happen, there has to be an element of motivation, an element of ability, can I do it? But there also has to be some sort of prompt, something that drives you to actually act in a particular way. And there's a similar model from the nudge unit, the EAST model. The behavior has to be easy, it has to be attractive, it has to be social, are other people doing it, but it also has to be timely. So we have to try and get to people at the point they're making a decision. And this brings me to my Goldilocks model. So for any behavior, there's some context, there's a risky decision point, and that leads to an action. We've been solving the awareness problem in completely the wrong place. It's not in the context where the threat lies. There's no way it's going to be remembered 6 months later, and it's not how your brain works, because your brain is making a decision based on these mental models. It's falling for the scarcity or the urgency. And then, of course, phishing sims are sitting over this side. It's too late. You're following up after the fact and telling someone off. Or there are other tools out there now that may be tapping into the seam. That's great. You know what behaviors have happened, but it's too late, and you're just telling people off after the fact. So what we want to be doing is priming people in the context where the threat lies, drip-feeding content as they open their email. Remember that phishing is a thing, and so it just becomes part of your day-to-day. But where it gets much more exciting is intervening exactly at the point of risk. So as you're about to upload that file to Dropbox, maybe a little intervention that says, oh, actually, we prefer you to use OneDrive. Or maybe as you're about to click that link, an intervention that says, you sure you know this sender? So that's how you can get some stats a little bit like this. Let's show some examples. So I talked about this idea of priming people. You need to introduce the concept. You don't want lengthy e-learning, and by lengthy I include 5 minutes, because at the end of that, how much are you really going to remember? I'm talking about 90 seconds tops, really, because you can hit home with a really, really important piece of information and that people are going to remember for the next couple of weeks. So we have this concept of stories, and they come to you. They land on your desktop, and this gets us 80 to 90% engagement with content. No more chasing people to do their e-learning, it just comes to them. But then maybe when they open their inbox, a little reminder to say, oh, we don't want to get phished, remember to check the sender. This is just one example of a campaign we might run. But let's take that further. Now, I hope none of you would actually click this link, but if you were going to, maybe at the point you were going to, red flags could intervene and say, look, before you actually click this, are you sure you know who this sender is? And if you then measure how many people click that, which we do, you can get this incredible stat of 72.3% reduction in people actually clicking links from unknown senders. That's a macro risk change. That's nothing to do with simulation. That's real risk coming down. But if you actually carried on with this, decided to enter your credentials at this point, well, maybe intervening here with another red flag that says, look, you just clicked a link from someone you don't know. Now you're on a website entering a password and you've never been to this website. Are you really sure you want to do this? And again, you could track that and see a change, 57.8%. Another example, forgetting to lock your screen, a kind of cyber hygiene thing, slightly passive-aggressive. You could do a nicer one here if people do that, lock their screen, and thank you for locking the screen. And then finally, about to upload a file to the internet. Very generic nudge. You would normally change this for your organization. Say, look, we prefer you to use OneDrive. And it really works. We can see people switching in an organization where they didn't have mandatory. They were getting 26% engagement with their content, their e-learning. We're getting them 90%. This is at Doc Martin. So they've had 90% year on year for the last 4 years now. I'm just going to skip through this because I've run out of time. So just to pull that together, your traditional awareness relies on this idea that you train people, it sets their intention, and they just always behave that way. That's simply not how the world works. Context interferes, unfortunately. Macro context in terms of the culture of the organization, but also that micro context of what's really going on. Is there some urgency in what you're doing at this particular time? And so timeliness and context are fundamental if we actually want to change behavior. And that's where applying behavioral science allows us to actually get some of these stats and measure what really matters, which is behavioral change, using a tool like Red Flags. So if you'd like to find out more, we'll stand right at the front out there. Please come and ask us some questions. Thank you very much.